Welcome to Africa Express. Today we are at the African Presidential Archives and Research Center at BU. For the last 24 hours, I would say, our guests have been part of a symposium for African American and U.S. foreign policy. Our guest is Ambassador Jendayi Frazer, who is known as a policy leader and expert on Africa. She is presently the director of Carnegie Mellon's New Center for International Policy and Innovation. She is also the first U.S. ambassador to South Africa in 2004. Ambassador Frazer, you are welcome to Africa Express.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
You have done a lot of work in Africa. Could you kind of tell us some of the work that you have done recently?
Sure. As the director of Carnegie Mellon University Center for International Policy and Innovation, I've been there since January or February of 2009. We've been really focused a lot on trying to prevent violence in elections in Africa. The idea is that nobody should lose their life to have the right to express their opinion through casting a vote for a leader, whether it's a president or parliamentarian or local leaders. And so we held a conference in March of this year in Ghana, in which we looked at 5 case studies: Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya, Liberia, and Sudan. And we worked with the members of the electoral commissions from those countries, except for Sudan, because it was right on the eve of their election. We worked with civil society actors, ministers, and others to try to find lessons learned and develop an action plan for preventing violence in the upcoming elections in all 5 of those countries. So we're also doing the same. We're going to have a conference similar to that in December in Liberia.
And these 5 countries all have elections coming.
They all had elections coming up. Sudan, of course, has had an election, but of course it also has a referendum coming up in January 2011. Liberia has an election in November of 2011. Uganda has an election in 2011. Kenya just had its constitutional referendum, and then they'll have an election in 2012. So there's so many elections taking place across Africa, and there's a need really to, as I said, try to make sure that those elections are, of course, free and fair, but also are nonviolent.
But what are the strategies, if I would say, that you guys put in place to prevent violence?
Well, there's a lot of lessons that one can take from countries like Ghana and others that have had successful elections, even very, very closely contested elections. At the start, you need a very good election commission. And so working with the chairman and the commissioners, trying to make sure the composition is a fair composition. There were questions about how the chairman of electoral commission should be elected. Working with the continental associations to try to get the commissioners to communicate with each other, learn from each other. There was a lot of talk about training of domestic monitors and making sure that those monitors are not just there on the eve of the election, but have actually started working long before the election actually takes place, at least in terms of their training. Another lesson learned from successful countries that have not had violence is trying to work with all of the political parties and establish inter-party commission where those parties can start working with the Electoral Commission very early on, and any grievances that any party has, they're expressed in the context of that commission, and so that they don't start mobilizing their population for violence. And obviously working with the politicians themselves, because often it's the politician that will try to incite a community for their own personal benefits. And so establishing some types of code of conduct for politicians. And this is all embedded within the framework of the African Union and the new Partnership for Africa's Development.
Okay, and these people, let's say the people that are running for the election, they actually agree to this, that they would abide?
Yes, well, yes, of course, some do and some don't, but it's easy to agree to something. But when you're actually in the, the throes of a hotly contested election, will you actually adhere to it? And that's where trying to have those grievances with the political parties, you build the confidence prior to the election. That's where training domestic election monitors, and so you're creating barriers to violence. You can't depend on any one individual. You can't depend on a commissioner, even though they're trained and they know what they should do. In that moment, they may not. They may come under tremendous pressure. They may be bribed. Anything can happen. So you create redundancies of barriers to violence, and that's some of the work that we're trying to do through the commission. Another aspect of that, of course, is to try to make the elections more transparent and to try to help the voters themselves become educated on the issues so they're not as easily used by politicians.
I think it's a great work, and I think it's one of those things that Africa definitely do need, because in the past, most of the elections has not been transparent, and not only that, and is full of violence. So I think that that is a very good thing to be doing with the African governments, and I really do hope that they can adhere to it, and so that we can start seeing some sort of fair elections.
Yes.
Some of the African countries has been a target for the radical Muslims. Do you see this as a problem in terms of stability in the continent of Africa?
Yeah, well, most African countries have different religious groups, different ethnic groups, and especially on religion, there's been tremendous tolerance over many decades. So for the most part, this has not been a problem in Africa. There are some areas, particularly the Horn of Africa, where you see it becoming more of a problem. In other words, there's a lot of foreign actors that have come into Somalia as fighters. And so, yes, it is a problem. And I think that obviously anybody with ill intent, terrorist groups, criminal organizations will use weak institutions. They will use the lack of, how would one say, ungoverned space, right? So that porous borders, they will use those conditions in African countries to operate. And so it is certainly a problem in general, but I don't think it's a problem as much about tolerance within society, because I think most African countries have had tremendous religious tolerance. But, in terms of weak institutions and vulnerability to exploitation, certainly it's a problem.